So anyway, I gave this talk a funny title, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Concrete Durability, which could be happiness to a concrete nerd. And a concrete nerd is defined as somebody who likes to listen to concrete. And there he is right there. But I thought in particular, I'd talk about sulfate attack, including DEF. I met Michael in 1989, at least I believe that was when I met him, at an ACVCANMET conference up in Trondheim, Norway. And here we are. He was working at BRE at the time. We both look a little younger. We were on a midnight cruise. They took us on a midnight fishing cruise because it was midsummer evening. The sun never goes down there. So there we are at midnight in the sun. And you can also see Jeff Osborne from BRE grabbing me on the upper left, and Big Mike, I can't remember his last name, measuring an imaginary fish in his hands. An important part of BRE has been Michael's informal office at St. Albans, which is the Garibaldi pub, just down the road from BRE, where they've been discussing research for 35 years. There's Mike again with Jeff Osborne again, who's pointing his finger, and then John Matthews, other former colleague. Michael came to Canada. I let Michael know at that meeting that I was leaving Ontario Hydro. He applied for the position I had at Ontario Hydro at the research division, and he got it. So he started his journey to Canada in 1990. He then came to the University of Toronto in 94, became an academic, and you can tell he's an academic here in this picture because he's got a beard. And then in 2002, he decided to move closer back to England, moved to UNB in Fredericton, just almost halfway to England. The problem was to get to England from Fredericton, he pretty much has to fly back to Toronto, then get a flight to England. But anyway, we've continued to collaborate on many projects we did beforehand and we do now, especially related to standards. We've been involved with a lot of industry projects that have influenced standards, even single standards, not standards, including chloride binding, influence of chloride binding, ternary mixtures to mitigate ASR. We did that for the cement industry in Ontario with the highway department here. Delayed Ettringite formation, I'll talk more about that. And Portland-Limestone cements, working on the background to justify including Portland-Limestone cements in the various standards in Canada and then in the US. We've also had a joint project working on sulfate resistance of Portland-Limestone cement together with SCMs, which resulted in 2 PhDs, and I'll talk more about that. So I'm going to talk again, as I mentioned, the 2 projects. One of them is the PhD. We jointly supervised a PhD of Terry Ramlochan. Unfortunately, Terrence died of heart failure about 10 years ago now. But it was an amazing piece of work where we discovered that sufficient levels of SCMs were eliminated the risk due to VEF, and he found out why that worked. And the role of alumina and SCMs was key to providing that mitigation. And then in 2009, we had 2 separate PhDs, but jointly funded by the Cement Association of Canada to look at the sulfate resistance of these Portland limestone cements because it was a concern. And the results have shown that there isn't a concern, and so they're now allowed. That's the quick and dirty study or summary. So delayed Ettringite formation. Some products, because this is going back quite a few years now, about 20 years, some cementitious materials or products, concretes, when heat cured, typically above 70 Celsius, may undergo deleterious expansion if later exposed to sufficient moisture. And this has been referred to as DEF, due to an abundance of Ettringite found in the damaged concrete. And it started with railway ties. First mentioned in the 1970s in Germany, concrete railway ties that were heat-cured precast ties started to crack up and lose their pre-stress. And it was related to the elevated temperatures, maybe curing conditions, cement composition. And then there were other cases of DF reported in various places, including US, Canada, Finland, South Africa, and Australia. And most of these associated with type 3 or higher strength cements. And some other precast units that were exposed to high temperatures without intentional heat curing, not hard curing, such as this girder in Texas. There's a precast girder which cracked up before it even went into surface. And people said it was ambient temperature DF, but really it was cast in the hot sun. And I'm sure it got up to about 90 degrees Celsius inside the concrete during the curing. And so type 3 cements that perform quite well at room temperature, and these are expansion graphs versus age going out to about 3 or 4 years here. At room temperature and at up to 60 degrees C, you don't see any expansion. They just keep going out there without any expanding. The concrete's quite fine. But then when you get to 70 degrees C, in this case, the expansion starts to creep up over time. After about a year, it starts to creep up. And 0.5% expansion is a lot of expansion. We typically talk about 0.04. Expansion is the expansion you need to crack concrete. So these are mortar bars. So 0.1 for mortar bars. And then you see as the temperature goes up, that expansion occurs earlier and gets bigger. And so that was the problem, that some of these heat curing regimes were going to very high temperatures, intentionally or unintentionally, to accelerate the curing to get the early strength. Typically for precast products, they're trying to get that early strength. So these were just heat cured for several hours at those temperatures and then placed in water, and they expanded over time. And then we also did some work with concrete. So I didn't get a chance to update this graph, but you see the same story. When these concretes were exposed, type 3 cement concretes, two different ones here, at 80 to 95 degrees, we're getting deleterious expansion over time. But it's happening after about a year. So, but not all cements will expand when you cure them at these high temperatures. And not even all type 3 cements will expand at those temperatures. But people tried to commit, various people were doing research on this at the time and looking at chemical parameters, but chemical composition cannot predict whether they're going to expand or not. Somebody came up with a formula, you apply other data to it and found it didn't fit anymore. So here's some examples. There's a type 3 that expanded. There's a type 1 high alkali that's expanded. Meanwhile, a type 2 expanded, but not a type 5 or a type 1 low alkali cement. So there are certainly cements that are more susceptible than others. Now, when you cure concrete at normal temperatures, this is a type 3 cement, the Pore solution analysis over the first 24 hours on a log scale. Typically, you'd see the alkalis in solution, and you'd see hydroxyl in solution, and the sulfate in red here would typically form gypsum and ettringite, precipitate gypsum and ettringite, and then the concentration would come down, then the hydroxyl concentration would go up to keep a balance of cations and anions. So that's what normally goes on. Usually by 24 hours, there's no sulfate or no significant sulfate left in solution. Not at room temperature, that's what happens. So there's no problem there. However, if you cure at high temperatures, such as at 95 degrees C, the same cement, then what happens is it looks the same up to about 4 hours when the heat curing was applied. And then what you see is that the sulfate doesn't disappear. It remains constant or slightly enlarged. And because the sulfate's up, the hydroxyl doesn't come up because they have to balance the negative charges. And so where is that sulfate going? Normally, and the ettringite is disappearing. Any existing ettringite gets destroyed at these temperatures, and some monosulfate forms, precipitates out. But a lot of the sulfate gets absorbed into the CSH itself, and that becomes part of the story. And if you look at temperature effects, these ratios of a bunch of EDX points on CSH, what you see here is the sulfur to calcium ratio versus the alumina to calcium ratio. So there's more sulfur in the CSH when it's been cured at these high temperatures, whereas lower sulfur at 60 degrees, which is more representative of what you'd see at the lower temperatures. So there's a big shift in the sulfur that's contained in the CSH itself, and the Pore solution increases as well with that higher sulfur in the CSH. And then what happens afterwards is you put the concrete in, or the mortar bar, in this case, in water, and you get leaching. And so the sulfate starts to come out. So the sulfate's coming out of the, so it starts at 1 day, you get these high sulfate ratios, and then at 64 days, 90, going down to several years here, the sulfur is coming out of the CSH. So that's what all these dots are. It's the sulfur levels within the CSH itself. So that's the CSH layer on the right-hand side. Pointer options. It's your pointer there. So this would be the CSH layers, and that sulfur is going out of the CSH and coming out into the surrounding matrix. And so this is just a schematic. The CSH, the sulfate was in the CSH. It's then exsolving out through the system and getting removed over time. So the sulfates largely come out because of the alkali leaching. If alkali leaching is prevented, sulfates tend to remain in the CSH and you don't get any expansion. This is work that Charlotte Fahmy did. She was working with Karen Scrivener at the time. They were doing her PhD about the same time as Terry did. And you see that in a high potassium hydroxide solution, there's no expansion. But when you reduce the high hydroxyl ion concentration in the Pore solution, the expansion started to climb, and in pure water got the most expansion because it's leaching out the sulfate from the CSH, and it's reacting to form this delayed ettringite. This somewhat ties up to ASR because often DEF was associated with ASR damage because ASR also binds up alkalis and takes it out the Pore solution, reduce the pH somewhat, such that you might get expansion. And again, this just shows the leaching. 1 day you've got the sulfate in red here, and the alkalis in say potassium in green. And 1 day you put it in lime water after the heat curing, and then they start to leach out. So they come down, the pH drops, not to really low numbers, still above the corrosion threshold. So they're going from 13.4 to 7 to 12.7 is quite a bit. And what happens then, when that sulfate comes out of the CSH, you start to form this delayed ettringite in very small spaces within the matrix, the paste matrix. You see these little tiger stripe pattern things are ettringite that's formed in the paste. The other thing you notice here is this is a sand grain in the upper right, that the gap there is empty. So when the expansion occurs, the paste is expanding away from the aggregate and creating gaps around the aggregate. And then over time, CSH doesn't like to be in, or any crystals don't like to be in small spaces, so that ettringite redissolves and reforms into the interfacial transition zones. So you see ettringite here in the lower left, marked by an E, where ettringite is formed in those gaps. Some places calcium hydroxide has also done the same thing and filled in those gaps. So the gaps were not initially filled. The gaps were empty because of the swelling of the paste, and then the ettringite filled in those spaces due to Ostwald ripening of moving small crystals in confined spaces into open areas where there's less energy. And over time, of course, more time, you see every one of these sand grains. These are Ottawa sand mortar bars. You see the gaps surrounding each one of those aggregates due to the swelling, plus some cracking in the matrix. And that's what's causing the swelling. The swelling was there because of the gaps that formed due to the swelling of the paste. The ettringite in the interfacial transition zones is just a sign. It didn't cause the expansion, it just is there. So we can avoid DEF. Best way is to stay below the temperatures, somewhere around 60 or 70 degrees. Stay below those temperatures, you typically don't get the problem existing, but that's not always practical. Mass concrete, often you have to control heat evolution. People try and control it to lower these lower temperatures, but sometimes they can't. High external temperatures, some of the precasters in the Southwest US were casting at 50 degrees Celsius, and then in steel molds and outdoor exposures in the sun, so these concretes were getting baked. And that in part may have led to some problems. And sometimes there's problems in implementing temperature limits. I think people are much better now. That this is 20 years ago. People are much better now with wireless sensors implementing temperature, thermal controls on concrete. But the other thing is that alumina-bearing pozzolans and slag are effective at suppressing or even eliminating this expansion at temperatures at least up to 85 and sometimes higher. And this is resulting largely from the study that I'm talking about that we did with Terry Ramlochan. And so here's some data showing silica fume. There's an expansion without silica fume. 8% silica fume reduced it. 15% did for a while, it delayed it. And then 20%, which is a ridiculous amount nobody would ever use, seemed to control it at least for long enough. But silica fume doesn't have any alumina in it, so it wasn't particularly effective at replacement levels anybody would use in practice. However, metakaolin, which is aluminous sulfate, that same cement, you can see even at 8%, 12%, even 4% controlled the DEF. And so the alumina seems to have a play in this. And you see the same thing with blast furnace slag, which has alumina, not as much as metakaolin. Even 10% slag helped, but not sufficiently. And a really high alkali cement, type 3, with 25 slag wasn't enough either. But you can see that generally 25 to 35% slag was sufficient to control the DEF. Class F fly ashes were effective at 15 through 35% in controlling expansion. And ternary blends, these are slag and silica fume mixtures and silica fume and fly ash mixtures. And the one with very little fume and not enough sea ash didn't control it sufficiently. So we're seeing this effect of the SCMs with aluminates are effective in the most part. And it's interesting. Here's the 25% Class F fly ash, cured at 95 and then stored in water for a year and a half here. There's Ettringite filling an air void here. You can see the fly ash particles residual. There's no cracking in the matrix and there's no gaps around the aggregate. So Ettringite has formed, or secondary Ettringite has formed, but it's filled in the air voids in open spaces that haven't caused damage. So what's going on? Why are they mitigating? SCMs, with SCMs, sulfate ions still get absorbed into the CSH. And they're also later released to form similar amounts of Ettringite. When we measured the amount of Ettringite in the mix with SCMs, it was pretty similar to what you'd get with the ones that expanded. But it comes down to where the Ettringite forms, whether there's expansion or not. So that the pozzolan or slag acts as a preferential source of alumina to react to form the Ettringite, react with the sulfate to form the Ettringite, instead of the monosulfate that's intermixed in that CSH. So instead of forming turning monosulfate into Ettringite, which can be expansive, forming Ettringite elsewhere where the pozzolans are, or moving those alumina from the pozzolans and the sulfate to open spaces where they formed. So the Ettringite's still forming, but they're forming in places where there is no expansion. So this all led to the CSA guidance. This is out of the 201 guide. There's also, I think, in the 308 guide, the Curing guide. And you can see I just circled the names here, Ramlochan's work, plus some of the work we did jointly and some other work that Mike did, are all referenced in this table, which basically says, if you're stay below 70 degrees, you don't need to do anything. Between 70 and 85 degrees, if you use alumina-bearing SCMs or ternary blends, you can use them. Or if you use low-strength vein cements, and I didn't talk about that part of it. We also did work on that. And then we say above 85 degrees, even though some of these systems worked at as high as 95, we're saying you shouldn't exceed it under any circumstances. So all this work, plus work of others, led to this table that currently exists on avoiding DEF problems in concrete. So it had some impact, this project. So I'll just take a non-musical interlude here as I switch topics. And here's Michael demonstrating liquid admixtures. Now, to switch to Portland-Limestone cements, we were originally approached in the Canadian standards, we were approached to discuss putting Portland-Limestone cements into the standard. And the people who objected the most to it were Mike and I, along with Bob Day at the University of Calgary. And so the industry decided to grease the squeaky wheels. So they funded Mike and I, and we got Michelle Knockin at Concordia to help out in writing a literature review on Portland limestone cement, the state-of-the-art report. So we did that for the CSA committee. It's published as a PCA report. It's still available. And we did that. And then in 2007, we presented that to the CSA committee. And as a result, we gave qualified acceptance in CSA in 2008 to Portland limestone cement. The only place where we thought there was not enough information was on sulfate resistance. I'll come to that. We did a similar review in 2010 for the US for ASTM, funded by the PCA. And then Mike, along with Jason Weiss and Paul Tennis, did another report just in 2011 to support that. I know I reviewed that report as well. So that was all to provide the background or rationale for including Portland limestone cements. They've been used in Europe for decades. They hadn't been used here. And of course, people want to know what's going on. How is this going to affect concrete? So the main concern we said was there's not enough information about sulfate attack. And there was a potential concern about thomsite sulfate attack, which involves carbonates as well as sulfates at low temperatures and attacks the matrix. And there'd been a case in the UK at the time. Nora Cramen had a conference about thomsite sulfate attack. And so people were concerned about this whole issue of thomsite sulfate attack. So we did a bunch of lab work. And then the Cement Association of Canada funded both Mike and I to develop some concrete outdoor exposure sites because people weren't happy with just mortar bar testing to demonstrate whether there was going to be a problem. So we started this in 2010. We both cast concrete mixtures, quite a few mixtures. I know I cast over 50 mixtures in Toronto, and Mike cast a similar number in the UNB, New Brunswick. And he supported Ashlee Hossack's PhD, and I supported Reza Ahani's PhD at Toronto. And so eventually this stuff, the short stories in the last bullet, based on now 11 years of data, back a few years ago, we accepted both in ASTM and CSA standards acceptance for sulfate exposure of PLC mixes, provided that you did the normal C10-12 mortar expansion tests. So the concrete backed it up. I'll just show you 3 slides here. We used a visual rating system. Mike had a different numerical rating system for his concrete that Ashlee did. And just we sort of used the stoplight approach. Green is good, red is bad, and other colors are in between. And so we just looked at these concretes on an annual basis. They were in these either mag sulfate or sodium sulfate, 15,000 ppm underground in temperatures that range from 3 degrees C to 15 degrees C in year round because they were stored underground, and monitored their condition. So I'll just show you a few slides. So this is after 54 months or 4.5 years in sodium sulfate, 0.4 water cement ratio concretes. GU here is the Canadian type 1 cement with 40% slag. Here's an equivalent cement, but with 15% limestone in it and 40% slag. There's no difference whether the limestone's there or not. And when we bump this slag replacement to 50%, there's still absolutely zero damage. It's in excellent condition. But the interesting thing is our benchmark here with these studies is compared to what people were doing now. People accept type 5 cements or HS in Canada, cement concrete for sulfate resistance. And you can see the difference at the same time. The type 5 cement that is normally used, and this is a cement available in Western Canada and Northern US, and it was severely damaged at 0.4. This is another product that's a blended sulfate resistant cement with 30% class F fly ash in it, and it performed about the same. So those two on the right were already allowed in the standard. The PLC ones were not allowed at the time. And if we go over, here's another limestone cement at 10.5% limestone in it. Again, this is only 33 months old, but it's performing as well as 2 other type 5 cements that are being used commercially. And when we bump the slag replacement of the Portland limestone cement to 50%, there's absolutely no damage again. Anyway, there's a lot of data in this report, which you can download. I've got the web address there from the PCA. We wrote this in 2016. We've both collected data. I know I did data in 17 and 18, collected further data, which is not in that report. And Mike, I think, repeated his work again this year to get more up-to-date data. I'm hoping, because of COVID, I haven't been able to dig up the site for the last 2 years because they won't let our students go to the site during COVID. So hopefully next spring I'll get 12-year data on this study. I've got over 1,000 beams buried underground here in my study. So the conclusion from that joint study is the addition of SCMs greatly improves resistance to sulfate attack. Nothing new there. Most of the SCM blends with GU and UL cements are outperforming sulfate-resistant cement concretes that have been allowed for years. And there was no consistent trend of the impact of limestone content on the performance of those mixtures at the same SCM levels. So in other words, the limestone did not make anything worse. We didn't see thomsite damage. We didn't see any other significant damage. So as a result, ASTM 595 and ASHTO M240 allowed type 1L with up to 15% limestone in 2012. And based on this research, the standards now permit these cements in proper combination with SCMs to be used in sulfate exposures, just using the normal ASTM C1012 test limits. Also, ACI, the building code in 2019, removed any previous restrictions on the use of type 1L in sulfate exposures. So this work had an impact on that. And I'll just finish up because finally, Michael has collaborated with many excellent researchers. We've heard from several of them today in these sessions. He's made a lot of outstanding contributions to ACI and other standards agencies, ASTM, CSA. He's nurtured the development of numerous brilliant students who've now become influential researchers. We've heard even from a couple of those today who were influenced by Mike's work as students. He has influenced concrete knowledge and concrete standards globally. So the impact of the ASR work, for example, is pretty much global now. It's been great working with Michael. We're still collaborating on several projects at the moment, and it's great to have him as a longtime friend.